Harvey was raised here, on the streets of Mumbai, with a polythene sheet as a roof, an open drain as a toilet, and no access to water, electricity, or sanitation. When Murli was in just the 3rd grade, he dropped out of school, and for the next 10 years of his life, was stuck in a vicious cycle of local gang life, unemployment, anxiety, and depression. Why? I'd like you for a moment to put yourself in the shoes of 8-year-old Murli on the streets of Mumbai. You walk in late to school because you spent the morning protecting your mother from being viciously beat up by your father. You take out your math homework, which is incomplete because as you were working on it last night, your drunk neighbor told you that all you would amount to in life is either an alcoholic or a scavenger, just like your dad. Your teacher, seeing your incomplete homework, berates you in front of all of your peers, calling you lazy, distracted, a disappointment, and bound for failure. In this moment, what are you feeling? Angry, maybe? Misunderstood? Isolated? Confused? You're not failing because you want to, and you're certainly not failing because you're not trying. You're failing because there's this huge, huge gap between where you come from and where you're expected to succeed. From an educator's perspective, one might say that Murli's academic failure was just too important to ignore. And until the major gaps in his education had been addressed, he really couldn't climb up the social ladder. From an economist's perspective, one might say that since each member of Murli's family was making less than $1 a day, he couldn't see any real social or financial mobility until everyone was earning more. Both are very real and very valid perspectives. But beyond all the academic lenses through which we see poverty, beyond the data and the complex models, is a very real human perspective that we miss too often. And that's the perspective of how where our kids come from impacts who they believe they can become. Earlier this year, as I was teaching a group of rambunctious middle schoolers in inner city Baltimore, the classroom, which I'd struggled to deal with behaviorally for months, became pin drop silent when gun violence came up in a discussion about what the kids wish they could change most in their lives. Half the students in my classroom had either lost a best friend or a family member in the last year to a stabbing or a shooting. One of my students, Kayla, usually the most dominant, the composed, the most confident student in my classroom, erupted into tears and ran out of the room. When I went outside to see what was wrong, Kayla pulled me into the tightest hug and said, "I'm so scared. I got my report card today, and I'm failing across the board. And I know that in all probability, I'm going to be held back in the 8th grade. But last Halloween, I saw my cousin get stabbed to death in front of me. His blood was on my hands. So while I know I'm supposed to care about school, all I really care about is if I'm going to be the one that's murdered next." So from a very real human perspective, and in both Murli and Kayla's own words, what led to many of their challenges unraveling the way that they did? A huge, huge gap between what they were asked to care about and what they actually so deeply cared about. Adverse childhood experiences, also called ACEs, are traumatic events like physical abuse, psychological abuse, and sexual abuse that happen at a young age and have long-term negative effects on a child's physical and psychological well-being. An ACE score of a 4 out of 10 puts a kid 460% more at risk for developing depression and over 1,000% more at risk for attempting suicide. The average score of the kids that we work with in Mumbai and Baltimore is a 6. And when asked how the trauma and the toxic stress that they had faced as kids had impacted them emotionally, many of our kids say that the thought of not becoming anything had bred in them deep helplessness and despair. where they came from made it so impossibly difficult for them to get where they needed to be. Or at least where they thought they needed to be. I come from a background as a storyteller, and one of the big questions that always fascinated me most in my time as a documentary filmmaker is how people find meaning in where they come from and how they act upon that meaning. When I first met Murli, I discovered that the biggest obstacle holding him back from reaching his full potential wasn't really his lack of education or his lack of income or what he didn't have. It was a failure to recognize what he did have. He was gifted beyond measure in leadership, in emotional intelligence, and in bringing people together. He always looked at his community through the lens of what could improve and how he could be an integral part of that. He was a gem of a person, a gem of a thinker, and yet he thought he was nothing because he hadn't met these traditional markers of success that had been laid out for him, like passing high school, getting a degree, starting a family, and in his own words, becoming a good professional. As I met more and more young, passionate people like Murli, who had this remarkable capacity to think critically about their lives and what they cared about, and yet were dejected and jaded consistently by a system that saw them as a straggling data point, as opposed to these incredible fountains of humanity and inspiration, I started to wonder, how might we be able to channel what our kids care about most into real, tangible outcomes? What if we redefine the way we view success for our kids? Defined it by how at-risk youth choose to take risks, by how the marginalized are thinking far beyond the margins of their notebooks, and how kids who are told that their communities and futures are bleak and meaningless find meaning in where they come from and act upon it. These questions manifested in a nonprofit that I co-founded close to 2 years ago that works with at-risk youth in the slums of Mumbai and in inner-city Baltimore schools. Our kids come from some of the worst environments in the world, rampant with abuse, with violence, and with fear. And when they walk into our classrooms, they aren't told to put a veil on where they come from. Rather, they're asked, what is it that bothers you most about your life? What is it that keeps you up at night? And if you could, how would you change that? Kids work with us in small groups to identify one topic they feel passionately about changing in their school or community. They prototype a solution using only the resources that are available to them. And then they launch their ideas into action, all while building grit, resilience, gratitude, empathy, mindfulness, and a strong sense of meaning and purpose along the way. Studies have shown that actively practicing gratitude increases social support, that building positive emotions in our kids reduces the negative thoughts that lead to depression, that resilience is so strongly correlated with reduced rates of mental illness, and that abstract things, right, like character strengths, zest, hope, and love, contribute to deeper life satisfaction and fulfillment. And the way we build these skills is through something called a strengths-based approach, which is focusing on what's right, not what's wrong with our kids. So when we first met Murli, we didn't ask him about how much education he didn't have or his lack of income. Instead, we asked him, what are you good at? What are your talents? And what are you doing when you're feeling at your absolute best? It took a long time for Murli to answer these questions because he didn't know that he had existing strengths, let alone that he could actually channel those strengths towards a life path. But after trying to spend a lot of time understanding what made this dynamic 20-year-old tick, we discovered that he was happiest when he was leading, and that he cared so deeply that other kids in his community didn't end up in the position that he had been in once because of their own lack of self-worth. Discovering his strengths and that he could use those strengths to address something he cared about so deeply enabled Murli to overcome his fixed mindset, to become more resilient, and to rewire his life around what brought him the most joy: service to others. Today, Murli is teaching, leading, and mobilizing hundreds of at-risk youth around Mumbai to discover their own capacity to control themselves and their environments. He's also our director of operations today in Mumbai. But look at what Murli's been able to do for himself in the process. Discovering his strengths and that strengths could address a strong sense of purpose has enabled Murli to go back and achieve all of those traditional markers of success, like re-enrolling in school for the first time in a decade, passing the high school, being the first member in his family to go to college, and to make a competitive income. There's his high school pass certificate and his first ever college ID, which he couldn't be more proud of. Flaunts it wherever he goes. How? Because today, Murli believes that where he comes from in urban Mumbai is no longer a threshold, but really a catalyst of what he can become in life. I'd like to show you a few more of the amazing things that can happen when we focus on what's right with our kids.
My name is Kayla, and I'm from James McHenry Middle School. Okay, we're trying to show Baltimore that guns and bullets are not the answer.
You use songs and you affect people. Another person dies in the street. Every time when I wake up, that's another dream. Wake up. Put your hands up, put your guns down. Listen what the cops gotta say, listen with the sound. Put the law down, write it down. On the piece of paper, over time you talk to say, number, get up here and listen.
Every time someone blinks their eyes, another person dies, and it takes too long for them to realize.
हमने नारियल का पेड़ आता है ना, सूखा पेड़, उससे हमने झाड़ू बनाया और हम उससे ही हम हमारी बस्ती साफ करते हैं। और फिर वो कचरा हम जो बड़ी महापाली के वो आता है ना कचरे के डब्बा, उसमें हम लोग सब फेंकते हैं कचरा।
We are passionate about the project because we want to help children do better in elementary school.
आर्ट सिखाना म्हणजे पेपर फॉर आर्ट, वो मुझे बहुत पसंद है। खुद सीखा, फिर मैं बच्चों को सिखाने लगी, इसलिए मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगता है। बच्चे रोज इधर आते हैं हमारे क्लास में, इसलिए मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगता है ये।
As you can see, where our kids come from is so intricately connected to what they care about and who they are. And until we can give them the platform to think critically about how their environments affect their self-worth, our kids will continue to define who they are based on their failures in the traditional classroom. Researchers Alistair McGregor and Andy Sumner, seeing that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for eradicating poverty still really don't focus on the whole human being, proposed a new way that we might be able to measure progress in low-income communities. The first part of the measure is material well-being, which is the things we have in life, like money and education. The second is relational well-being, which is what we do with what we have. And the final and possibly most important part is subjective well-being, which are all those things that make every single one of us in this room human. Our goals, our aspirations, our inspirations, and the things that make us come alive. Subjective well-being is what we often focus least on in development, but what often matters most to our kids. It's time we think actively about how we can start integrating these ideas into our health and education systems, to bridge the gap between school and community so our communities become living classrooms where our kids can learn from what they care about most and begin to thrive. Murli, for me, was the spark that made me discover that possibility is universal, and that if we focus on what's right with our kids, we can empower the wildest of ideas in the unlikeliest of places. As Tupac Shakur so brilliantly put, we wouldn't ask a rose that grew from concrete why it had damaged petals. On the contrary, we would applaud its tenacity and love its will to reach the sun. Thank you.